in Charlotte, where our headquarters is, to build the Albemarle Technology Park. We will substantially increase the number of researchers and engineers who work for us, who will be looking at next generation battery technologies, process technologies, both at the plant level as well as the resource level. So we're really looking at ensuring that the world has enough of that battery grade lithium, but also what's coming next, and ensuring that we're there to deliver it.
Thank you very much. Brian, TechMet is partially owned by the US government through the development or the International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC. Not only talking about that, but sort of government financing in general. What do you think is needed from the United States, from North America, to try to basically level the playing field with China, right? Who is quite ahead with respect to supply chains and financing.
Yeah. Acceleration of the deployment of the DOE's loan program. Really good start. No, I think there's been massive progress with respect to analysis and understanding and appreciation of the enormity of the supply-demand dislocation and the challenges in bridging the gap or narrowing that gap for lithium and other critical minerals to feed the energy transition and climate change mitigation in Washington and Brussels and Tokyo and elsewhere. Still 15 years behind the appreciation that was, in place and implemented and executed in Beijing with respect to strategies to secure overwhelmingly dominant position across all of these global critical mineral supply chains. But nonetheless, there's been massive progress, and obviously the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, etc., are total game changers and have catalyzed a lot of activity, and the extent of that is obviously, some of it is still to be demonstrated by the acceleration of implementation and deployment, but it's enormously significant for the US aligned supply chains, and it's an enormously important catalyst and wake-up call for Europe and Japan and Korea, who are starting to realize that they can't rely on a US umbrella, and they can't continue to rely on Chinese-dominated supply chains, given the fact that China will doubtlessly advantage their own domestic industry relative to continuing to support industry in the US and elsewhere, and we use it as a tool in any escalation of new Cold War, conflict or tension. So that's all great. I think there is still an underappreciation of the enormity and scale of this dislocation. And I think there's a lot of naivety on the part of not only government agencies, but providers of capital and end users of our products, the automakers and others, with respect to the supply element of the equation. There's an assumption. We come from a background of building mines and processing facilities, and we're intimately aware daily and weekly and monthly of how difficult it is to build big projects on time and on budget and actually deliver, and what it takes in terms of enabling infrastructure, in terms of skills, in terms of, the management of communities and regulatory environments, in order to do that successfully, to produce and scale what we need to feed this transition, and to do it responsibly, and to do it with high ESG standards and low carbon footprint, which we and a lot of the industry, including Albemarle, are at the forefront of doing to transform responsibly to feed this global energy transition and climate change mitigation. So government, the US government has become ahead of the game, but we need a lot more, a lot quicker. We're really scratching the surface. I mean, you know the numbers much better than me, but I mean, if you just look illustratively at Tesla, which is just EVs, batteries for EVs, and one car company, if they're to reach their target of 20 million vehicles a year in 2030, that alone would require almost twice the present global total annual supply of lithium, before GM, before Ford, before VW, and before the Chinese, who are going to continue to grow quicker than us and continue to produce 2/3 of the world's batteries and vehicles. So, we've made massive progress, and we're working, obviously the DFC is a government funding agency of substantial shareholders of ours, and we're busy with them in a number of programs outside and projects outside the US, and we're busy, with the DOE and DOD and others. So there's a massive escalation of prioritization and attention and engagement in this challenge. But it is just the beginning, and it is arguably 5 years later than it should have been. I mean, the private sector, catalyzed and de-risked and supported by governments like the US, namely the US, which is overwhelmingly dominant and important in the world we want to succeed. We needed to deploy $100 billion 5 years ago across these critical minerals to avoid the structural cliff of inescapable undersupply we're heading for in the next 3-4 years, regardless of short-term volatility and little overshoots and a little bit of oversupply here. It's irrelevant. It's getting worse and worse. And the implications of the structural short supply are, again, ones that we haven't started to adequately analyze and get our heads around. And they're big, for climate change goals, for, industrial competitiveness and jobs, for geopolitical stability and national security, for inflation. It really is a crucial front in two wars. One is the war against climate change, and the other war maybe is a word we shouldn't use, but the competition with China for global technological, industrial, commercial, and ideological dominance. So we can't overestimate or over-exaggerate the moment in history we're in for critical minerals.
Thank you, Brian. For the audience, 5 years ago, prices were very low, investment dropped as well. So the moment we needed investment, we didn't get it, right? Jonah, he's been nice to you, and at the same time, he hasn't exactly been nice to you, right? So you're ahead of the game now, but you need to be doing things much quicker. So at least I think we can say that the DOE is really stacked with money right now after specifically the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the IRA. So how are you guys looking at lithium as a strategic commodity? What type of loans have been made? What are some of the plans moving forward as well?
So in many ways, passing the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law feels a little bit like the easy part. And now it's time to get to work. And so just to zoom out for one moment on the Department of Energy. So the establishment, I think for the first time, of a coherent industrial strategy in the United States is a really big deal. And for the Department of Energy specifically, it has led to a realignment of the department organizationally. Historically, we've been 2/3 nuclear industrial complex, 1/3 research and development in 17 national labs, and then my office, the Loan Programs Office, alone in the wilderness doing deployment work. And with the passage of bill and IRA, that was a $100 billion infusion into the DOE's budget, the largest in our history since we were founded. And our, Secretary Granholm's tagline of deploy, deploy, deploy is kind of our marching order. And the organization itself has been realigned to deliver on that mandate. And the Loan Programs Office, we're sort of the tip of the spear. So we're at the point where the technology is proven, but it hasn't yet achieved commercial liftoff. And there's an opportunity for us to invest early and pull forward the timeline for scale, which is what is needed right now. We at the Loan Programs Office, we make loans, but we have a threefold mandate. We support or operate as a bridge to bankability for emerging clean energy technologies. We strengthen domestic supply chains, including in particular the battery supply chain, where we've been very active. And then we make energy transformation that much of the country is going through right now achievable and affordable for communities, workers, and consumers through a whole range of programs that, following the passage of the IRA, our loan authorities increased from around $42 billion to close to $400 billion, which is, pretty soon starts to add up. It's a lot of money. Right now, our pipeline, we have about $143 billion of loan applications seeking funding from our office. And I won't give a precise number, but many billions of that are in the battery supply chain and a pretty significant number focused specifically on critical materials processing and lithium specifically. We have 2 programs that can be used to support lithium processing specifically. That's our Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Program. That program supports manufacturing of component inputs into passenger and light duty vehicles, and following the passage of bill, that was increased to medium and heavy duty vehicles, air transport, marine transport, and hyperloops somehow made it in there as well. I don't know if they need lithium in hyperloops.
Sure you do.
I'm sure you need it for everything. And then on Title 17, yeah, we should fact check that after. We also need
We're
lithium.
not talking any Hyperloop or supplies at this point.
I can comment myself. Our applicants are subject to the Trade Secrets Act, so business confidential. And our other program is our Title 17 Innovative Clean Energy title for supply chains. And under both of those, we can finance lithium projects. In the last 12, 14 months, we've made 3 conditional commitments or loans to lithium processing facilities here in the US. One to the Ioneer Rhyolite Ridge facility in Esmeralda County, Nevada, which will produce lithium carbonate enough for about 370,000 electric vehicles on an annual basis. And then we've made 2 loans into the battery recycling space. So one to Redwood Materials. They are going to produce ultra thin copper foil as well as cathode active material for electric vehicles. And we also made a loan for Li-Cycle based up in Rochester, New York. They're the largest lithium ion sustainable pure play battery recycler, I think, in the United States today. And that will be able to support about 200,000 electric vehicles per year, again, producing battery grade lithium carbonate among other critical materials. So very active in this space. I would say of the 10 or 12 conditional commitments we've made in the last 18 months, 2/3 plus have been in the battery supply chain specifically. So this is where we're seeing a lot of activity. And a lot of these projects, frankly, are starting to be bankable. So I think I mean, if you look at the data, the curve is like this on all fronts. But we are, we're not starting ahead, right? We are starting behind.
Thank you for your answer also. George, let's get to the Department of State. That means that automatically we end up in geopolitics. We automatically talk about China as well. Lithium is interesting because actually a lot of lithium is in Chile, in Australia, allied countries, right? But a lot of that lithium is also under offtake agreements with Chinese players. How does state think about that, about sort of lithium and the geopolitical tensions around the supply chain?
So first of all, I'd like to point out so later on today, my boss, the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, will be speaking here. So I don't want to steal any of his thunder. But
that's in a private dinner, so at least entertain the crowd.
So he knows what the word offtake means, right? That's not something that the previous Undersecretary for Energy and Environment. So from a bureaucratic standpoint, we've really changed a lot. And there's a lot more people focused on this. We're probably still catching up with what type of reaction we need for the stark picture that Brian depicts. But I mean, I'm here. We are really tracking these issues a lot more closely. Although Ellen was tracking them when she was around for the department, for the government. So part of what we're doing is kind of encouraged by the amount of stuff that our friends at DOE are doing domestically, or that the Department of Defense is doing domestically. We get to go out around the world and talk to our partners and say, we need you guys to do the same thing, and we need you to do more of it. And the principal North Star here is really meeting our climate goals, right? Like, we take a step back. This isn't just about mining because we want to mine. This is mining because we don't want the temperature of the waters of this world to increase. And so we last year here in New York, the Secretary of State kicked off a meeting of the Mineral Security Partnership with the partners of the MSP, which is how we call it, which currently now have essentially the G7 countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Well, I was going to get there.
Italy.
Australia, Canada, well, Canada's a G7 country, but South Korea, and of course, India is our latest addition. So having those countries commit to, number one, that we need more production. Number two, that we need supply chains to be diversified. Now, lithium may be slightly more diversified than some of the other kind of minerals that we're tracking, but it's still processed at a very high degree in one place. And so we do want to kind of change that, that picture. But to kind of Ahmed's point on the growth year on year, it shows that even though we are slightly behind, most of the pie still has to be built. Most of these supply chains need to be built. So there really is kind of a moment of opportunity for the US and our allied partners to really move the needle on a lot of these. And from a foreign policy perspective, it's great we're doing a ton of stuff domestically, but we're also getting the DFC to learn how to do more in this space. And I mean, working with TechMet is obviously kind of the prime example of the DFC operating in this space. And it's helping them get comfortable, I think, with investments in this sector, which historically has been tricky. But also giving direction to the World Bank, giving direction to EXIM to support loans that, I mean, there are constraints there because there's a requirement for US exports. But the whole US government now is really kind of moving towards these goals. And we're getting our, say, EXIM folks to talk to Export Finance Australia or K-SURE in Korea. And that it becomes a force multiplier because different entities can essentially explore transactions, learn from those, and then share lessons learned with their government kind of colleagues, which will speed up the deployment of their products abroad. And so recently, the IFC made a loan to a lithium mine in Argentina. My first step was to talk to the IFC and ask, well, how did they structure that loan, and can they help our folks in a jurisdiction that has been difficult for financiers? So that's what we're doing, and I think the road ahead is long, but there's a lot of opportunity in this space, and we're paying attention.
So quickly to follow up on that, I think generally the story goes that China was very prepared. They had the Belt and Road Initiative that kind of paved the way for the private companies to take over and assume all sorts of risks around the world. An institution like the World Bank focused, I think, in the last decade more on clean power. So when I hear you saying that this debate is moving, so even within basically the international financial institutions, the US is leading that debate to say maybe we also need to look at diversifying where we put our loans, including upstream in the supply chain, not just downstream. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's not easy, right? When these entities are looking at support in this space, and Brian knows this, you really have to dig in and meet really high standards. You need to have the public comment on your plans for going ahead on a mining site. It's not easy. We think it makes supply chains more secure and more durable. But especially in the ramp up phase, it just takes more time.
I would say, though, that really any mine site needs to have that period of public comment. So I don't know if it's that much more rigorous to go through a DFC process, but I think that mining permitting is incredibly rigorous in most jurisdictions.
I mean, there are some jurisdictions.
Maybe where lithium is being produced.
For example, lithium,
yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, part of what we're doing to support this mission, as far as the State Department goes, is funding technical assistance and support for governments to ensure that is true everywhere, and to kind of level the playing field for investments everywhere.
And that does require government support in order to assist companies and countries to uphold high standards without compromising the competitiveness and the margins that justify acceleration of investment to build scale. And that's increasingly on the diplomatic and geopolitical front, that's frustrated and made an even greater challenge by the pendulum swing towards popular socialism across Latin America and a number of important resource countries, the inevitable tendency of politicians who want to be elected to eat the golden goose before it lays the egg, including in the US. You know, I mean, we're busy developing direct lithium extraction from geothermal brines in the Salton Sea in California, and California is imposing kind of royalties on lithium production before there's any lithium production, and hence retarding development and investment. And that's not, you know, that's the case in a number of key African countries. It's the case in a number of key Latin American countries where there's a sense that we're going to be the Saudi Arabia of lithium, and therefore, you know, we're going to be super rich and it's going to pay for everything. And we have to ensure that foreign companies and countries coming to benefit from the wealth of our nation, our people, you know, our guests who we're going to suck every last dollar out of because they're going to come anyway because we've got the resources. And that's, you know, highly problematic when you're trying to globally scale supply to meet an escalation of demand that we have to meet.
So I hear there's a consensus on the necessity to move quicker in the supply chain. I also hear there's a lot of challenges, a lot of steps that need to be made. Brian, I know you have certain thoughts as well about what would be some of the impacts of critical mineral shortfalls on, for example, the United States or Europe. That can be lithium, but also critical minerals in general. Do you want to sort of expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the implications of the ongoing failure on the part of our industry and big financial institutions to adequately support and invest in our industry, and governments around the world to be slow in de-risking and facilitating the transformation of our industry, and the shortfalls of the market that have failed us are numerous and very, very serious. You know, if you can't build, if you don't have the units of lithium and nickel and cobalt to adequately build the lithium-ion batteries we need to electrify mobility as one element of the energy transition and climate change mitigation, you know, we're going to need petrol engines and diesel engines, more of them for a lot longer. With the structural and severe underinvestment in hydrocarbons, exploration development, we're going to have $150 to $200 a barrel oil on and off for the next 10 years, which is, you know, very inflationary. We're going to have economies like Germany, you know, VW, I would put, and, you know, I'm sorry to single out a company, and they're, you know, a fantastic company in terms of technology and brand and design and ability to globally distribute and sell and manufacture. But they're spending, I don't know what the number is, $80, $90 billion electrifying their fleet over the next 10 years. And their concern with respect to preferential access to battery metals to feed their EV programs is fast turning to panic. But I mean, they're pretty clueless and they're 5 years behind where they need to be. And I'd put money on VW needing to go to the German government for a state bailout in the next 3 or 4 years. You can't build $80 billion of battery factories and EV manufacturing capacity and wake up and only be able to utilize half or 2/3 of your capacity because you just can't get the units of nickel and cobalt and lithium. And historically being able to phone up China and be supported with those inputs, as Tesla and others have been able to do, is not going to work, because China is going to be undersupplied with respect to their own needs. And China would far rather export electric vehicles to Europe to compete with VW than to export lithium hydroxide to Europe. And that's already started to happen. And it's going to be, it's an existential threat to the German economy. You know, 20% of the German economy is related to the auto industry, diesel and petrol driven vehicles. And even in a successful transition to EVs, if they are able to compete globally with the Chinese and others as VW and BMW and others, that would require, I guess, you know, 25% of the enabling industrial infrastructure and employment. if you on top of that are failing to compete because you don't have a clue of what goes into an electric, well, obviously you have a clue, but you don't know how to understand, assess, and engage in and control your supply chain because it's so different from building diesel and petrol engine vehicles. You know, it's devastating. You've got 10 years of recession in Germany, which has massive implications for the European Union. So I could go on and on, but it's serious.
Well said. The smile at the end was maybe the best. Let's interpret it. Okay, let's digest that for a second by asking an equally sort of challenging question. Ahmed, geopolitics.
Ahmed, are you? Yeah.
I was thinking if you're going to talk about it.
Absolutely, let's do that.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead? Go on.
No, please.
Okay.
You're all very kind people. That's fantastic. Ahmed, geopolitical sort of implications for the lithium market. To bring it quickly back to lithium, right? We've seen geopolitical upheaval across the entire supply chain. What are the impacts on the lithium market in sort of the years ahead? How do you see that?
So just taking a step back for a minute, just like to give the audience context. I think the first chapter in all of this was, Chinese offtakes, biggest lithium producers, Tianqi, Ganfeng, were, locking up low cost, very good quality spodumene from Australia. And also you have had the brine, obviously, from Chile. And I think that it's not just about, I think the point here was earlier made, that it's not just, when we're talking about lithium and geopolitics, this is not just about contesting China. This is also about meeting effectively that growth in demand. So this is actually this is also a bigger picture about electrification, the issue around what is the call on lithium and meeting that supply. And because it's not, I think people are slowly beginning to realize, including industrial players, that getting this stuff to battery grade quality and qualifying the material by an OEM is hard. So it's not just a question of the reinvestment rate or what is it's not just about marginal economics. This is also about effectively technical criteria to get this material into the value chain. But
when you say it's hard, could you quickly for the audience say what steps does it?
Yeah, I mean,
how long can that take?
So let me just give you an example. Like in China, for example, we've seen a lot of new mine supply, which is usually relatively has higher operating expenditure than say your low cost material in the market. But it's also got I think this is a familiar theme in the market, is that the ore quality is also degrading. So actually Chinese specs, or actually just battery grade chemical specifications, I mean, I'm sure Ellen can testify to this, whether it's, the big tier one players like Tianqi, Albemarle, all of these guys, they know how hard it is, particularly around impurity profiles and getting those, we're talking about parts per million here, so very specific qualities here. But the point about geopolitics here is also that I think that the pricing power at the moment is with the miners. I mean, that was made very clear, and it's still kind of made clear now, is that even though chemical prices have fallen, you've actually seen hard rock prices still quite high, actually. So spodumene prices, I think the behavior of these of players in Australia, they know that they have a lot of pricing power. So one of the questions, I think we raised it earlier today, and I think this is also a thematic, is a lot of players, whether it's, and this is a really interesting question about, big mining firms who have, who just like oil and gas and big mining have had a streak of capital discipline, share buybacks, being careful about capital allocation strategies. But even when the economics of lithium look great and attractive, and I won't name, just using a case study here, is that a big mining firm looked at a lithium asset, but one of the quid pro quos for that investment was, we're not just going to give you the exploration rights on this and, you know, actually work on this mining development. We want you to build everything. You're going to have to build the processing. You're going to have to bring in OEM. So governments themselves are also looking at this in terms of, you know, one of the conditions. And you're seeing that also amongst resource-rich countries who want value chain integration. And what is the consequence of that going to be? You know, 5 years ago, the most capital efficient route for lithium supply was a low cost source of mine material to China. And you know, Albemarle have put out very interesting numbers about, you know, what those refining capex intensities look like. In China, it's maybe say $10,000 a ton. But then look at the greenfield refineries being built now outside of China. The numbers are astonishingly high. So that naturally leads you to a view that the geopolitics is going to drive a higher incentive price. So investors are not only going to say, we want, the rate of return that we want is going to be this much. They're also going to say, well, actually, you know, geopolitics has made the, you know, more, governments have to be involved with, I mean, what TechMed is doing is quite interesting because you have government and effectively efficient private allocation strategies. So that looks like a thematic that has developed for this sector now. So in my view, I see that whether or not that new greenfield refining capacity comes online, geopolitics and cost inflation in the lithium industry is a reality.
All of a sudden, it matters very much where stuff comes from. Ellen, I'm sure you have thoughts about this exactly.
I do. You know, I think we need to take a step back and realize that China is going to continue to be really important. And so what's equally important is that the United States and the EU that have been other major, or traditionally been the major automotive manufacturing hubs grow. China is going to continue to be there. And so the US and the EU need to be smart about it. And what we're seeing is that IIJA and IRA have driven investments. So in Albemarle's case, we had already decided to reopen the Kings Mountain mine site and build a conversion facility. But through the IIJA, we received a $150 million DOE grant to build a concentrator for the Kings Mountain extraction facility. Just this week, I think it was this week, lithium time is fast. I don't know if it was this week or this past Monday or the Monday before, but DOD announced a $90 million grant for Albemarle for our Kings Mountain mine site. So that's incredibly meaningful. And then when you look at IRA, the 10% production tax credit is also very interesting for all the lithium that we produce in the United States. So there are some bright lights happening, some shining stars. You know, when you look at the public announcements in the United States, we should have enough. We should be self-sufficient on cathode manufacturing based on public announcements. We should be sufficient on battery manufacturing based on public announcements. The IRA provides, I think it's $45 a kilowatt hour in production tax credit, which makes it, many analysts have said it's the most cost-effective place to produce batteries in the world. Probably what's more accurate is it puts it on par with building a battery in China. That's incredibly important. And in the lithium space, looking at the public announcements, we've got some colleagues here that are also looking to develop mines. It doesn't look like we'll have enough lithium homegrown in the United States, but as we've mentioned earlier, and we've got FTA partners. And what we're seeing is, you know, our customers have to create a pull on this as well too, right? If they want to continue to get low cost, then they need to be, but that's not what we're seeing. I mean, for example, Ford just announced their lithium contracts, and we were listed, and they highlighted that we will be providing our lithium for Ford from FTA countries and from mine sites that have been certified by IRMA. So, you know, the industry is certainly is looking at all these geopolitical issues, and they're supporting, because as Ahmed said, the capital costs are higher, the operating costs are higher. So and then if we move to Europe, Europe actually had projections to have more battery manufacturing than the United States. So again, the IIJ and the IRA appear to be working if those public announcements come through. And they're, fast and furiously looking at, okay, how do we revise our legislation? The Critical Raw Materials Act, which hasn't been passed yet, but in its draft form will allow for 65% inputs from one country, which can also be a quite realistic way to look at things. But now they're running into some problems, as we know, on the geopolitical side because of the Chinese vehicles that are entering in. But again, I think in the end, it's what you talked about, George, is that we need to succeed in this because this is an issue on global warming. In order to do that, China, the US, EU, India, and other players, Australia, those that have resources, are going to want to be part of this really important sector that's probably one of the most important for this century.
Thank you. It's interesting you brought up the EU. I think already for years we hear the fear that the EU at one point is going to drive cars made in China with US technology. So now they're late to the game and they develop these type of things, right? And I hear us all here, I think, agreeing that ideally we don't let that happen, even though the US is late. We're now jumping ahead. And Joanna, I want to go back to the DOE. Some of the technologies, either big steps ahead or gradual improvements, also happen because of cooperation between countries, right? And I'm curious how that works for the DOE and for the LPO specifically, how they look at these type of international collaborations on technology with partner countries through your office.
Yeah. Well, I can just say I'm from Philadelphia, so I think we love a good underdog story. And I think it's not a bad place for the US to be every once in a while to be like, all right, we got to step it up, right? And I think that's a little bit of where we are. And I should say, just like right off the bat, my office and much of the Department of Energy is very much domestically focused. And so we rely on our partners at state and DFC and Exim Bank and the DoD to figure out how do we get the feedstocks that we need to build here and some of the extraction. My office won't look at it. We don't do extraction. We just do processing. But I think I said at the beginning that the Department of Energy has realigned organizationally around this moment. And one of the things that's happened is we've created a new Undersecretariat for Infrastructure, and that is specifically focused on the demonstration of technologies and the deployment of those technologies. And my office rolls up under it, but so does the Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains Office, which is a brand new office we invented out of whole cloth that's intended to focus on America's supply chains and in particular critical materials. And so that office is also overseeing the 48C tax credit that came through the IRA, that $10 billion that is somewhat flexible and can be used for critical minerals build out. And I will say, I think the secretary said after the passage of the bill that we were going to hire about 1,000 people to stand up this new office. And I'd say we're probably 2/3 of the way there. But for you SEPA students who are figuring out what you want to do next, we are still hiring, and in particular in this office, in the Manufacturing Energy Supply Chains Office, as we're building this capability ourselves. But we are now positioned as the Department of Energy to fund projects from a concept in a lab, first principles research, all the way through to deployment at scale. And so we, as Ellen mentioned, we have funding opportunities that have gone out. One closed back in July, specifically on, in this case, on direct lithium extraction from geothermal brines. And I think we have another one that's open right now, focused on innovative extraction, refining, recycling methods for critical materials, inclusive of lithium. Some of these early stage technologies, I think for the Loan Programs Office, for my office, we're still waiting to see the demonstrations and the pilots that prove out in specific applications how it would work, because obviously things like DLE are quite different if you apply it to a brine versus a deposit, like clay deposit versus a slurry. And for our office, we don't take technology risks. So we're really looking at this from the standpoint of what can actually, we make loans. So we want to make sure that we're going to get paid back. And so we'll take all the market risk and engineering risk all day long, but we want to make sure that these technologies work. And so to come back to your original point around partnering, I think a lot of the lessons that we're learning, we're constantly in conversations with our peers overseas to figure out who has proven what where, and what do we need to make sure that we're bringing to this country. And then we we talk to our colleagues at State and at Commerce and Select USA and try to figure out how to bring in the best and most promising technologies and production methods for critical materials like lithium, so that we can build them here in the US and build out that domestic supply chain.
George, can you talk a little bit about that? There's the positive story, collaboration. Obviously, the DOE, the Department of State, has a lot of levers, a lot of sort of factors through which it can influence the market. How is State thinking about using those levers to get a more secure supply chain? And if I may add to that, in 10 years' time, what does success with respect to supply chain resilience look like?
So I think, I mean, on the international engagement side, there's just a lot happening. Our labs are in constant contact with scientists from other countries. Something that actually came out of a Chinese embargo of rare earth element exports to Japan more than 10 years ago, kind of spurred interest in trilateral collaboration at the time. It was Japan, the EU, and the United States that joined into a group that essentially shares R&D. This right now, the group from a trilateral has expanded to all G7 partners. This was recently announced in Japan as leads of the G7. So that's essentially been reinvigorated to something that was very focused on rare earth elements, something that looks at broader minerals and kind of technology in that space. As far as our target in 10 years, if I were an EU diplomat, I think it may be easier, because in the Critical Raw Materials, or the draft Critical Raw Materials Act, they set specific targets for what proportion of the supply chain node they want in Europe.
But they're not binding. They're just
not
targets.
binding, and they haven't passed.
Right.
Yeah, no, there's a long road ahead.
Yeah.
On the US end, so one of our kind of North Stars is 50% of new EVs being sold, 50% of vehicles being sold being EVs by 2030. So that's less than 10 years away. But that is really the guiding star. To make that happen, we need a lot more minerals, and we will only do that responsibly, which is where kind of some of the other pieces come to play. But that is probably the closest I can give you to a target. We internationally, in addition to, it's called the Conference on Critical Materials and Minerals now, that trilateral that became a G7 group. There's also a lot of work happening at the International Energy Agency. Next week, there will be the first, I think it's the Clean Energy and Mineral Summit, which the IEA has put together. Secretary Granholm from DOE will be going, our Undersecretary will be going, but that kind of highlights some of the international cooperation happening in that space. That, and then the Mineral Security Partnership, we'll be having a ministerial a couple weeks after that in London. So there's just a very busy schedule to push for the building blocks that will feed into the 2030 goal, President Biden's 2030 goal.
Super. Thank you very much. I'm going to quickly open it up to the audience for a couple of questions, since I promised. I see someone laughing in the background. I think we almost need to wrap up, but at least 2 or 3 questions. Yes, sir. Do we have a microphone? Oh, could you go to the middle? There's a microphone right there. Yeah, thank you. And if you really feel like you need to make a comment, could you do it within 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes, I won't take more than 1 minute. My name is Manpreet. I'm a second-year student at CEPA, studying energy environment here. See, I've been studying a lot about the electric vehicle industry and the kind of demand, that we are seeing from the electrical vehicle industry. That is basically putting a lot of upward pressure on the prices on lithium. So I just want to understand, my question is basically for Department of Energy, if you could just throw some light on this issue. Like at the policy level, are we talking and discussing something about the alternatives to lithium ion, like sodium ion batteries or something? So if you can just throw some light on the alternatives. Thank you.
Yes, it's a great question. It is an area that we're spending a lot of time on. My office is seeing a number of different alternative chemistries for battery manufacture, including sodium ion, silicon anode, solid state, a lot of conversation around this, and also performance improvements to batteries that can make them more efficient and higher quality. Our office made a recent a conditional commitment to EOS just a few weeks ago, which is a zinc bromide battery. And it's an energy storage system, so it's not going into electric vehicles, but it's another alternative that offers different properties to your traditional lithium-ion battery, and over the long term could be more cost competitive on the grid and doesn't degrade as fast with repeat cycles in certain contexts. And so there's advantages to some of these alternatives. The challenge is the lithium-ion battery industry is like a juggernaut. And especially when you look at utility scale solar, which is where I spend a lot of my time. I think far and away, like it may not be in every case the best technology, but the rate at which the unit costs are declining and the learning curve that we are on with lithium is just unparalleled, basically anywhere else. And so for some of these other technologies to take off, we're going to have to, they're also starting from a bit of a standstill, and we're going to have to see quite a bit of investment and effort, most likely from our office and from probably other departments of energy around the world to see if we can make that happen. But it's a tough road to climb when everybody's already gotten on board, right?
I think what is interesting with sodium ion as well is for energy storage systems, why not? For small vehicles, why not? For the type of cars that a North American consumer wants to drive, it's very unlikely that sodium ion will be the battery in that vehicle. It's too big, it's too heavy, it needs, too much of a range. Next question.
Hi, how do you do? Elizabeth Halliday, Clean Capitalist Leadership Council. Thank you all for coming. Great panel. My question involves permitting and permitting timelines. It's a hot topic. Can you please explain a little bit about what goes into making an application and how you're able to comply with these accelerated timelines and how it might make a difference if some of this reform legislation was passed? Thanks.
Yeah.
I can speak to, obviously we permit globally, and I think you're focused on the United States. And first of all, we're not advocating for rushed permitting. We want to be clear on that, right? There's a whole process that we need to go through. In Kings Mountain, we're gathering the environmental baseline data, we're engaging with the community, and we're transparently sharing every single report that we develop with the community. And we're actually going beyond. For example, because of we follow the IRMA standard, Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, we're doing what we call an ESHA, which is an environmental social impact assessment, which other mining jurisdictions require, but we don't in the US, but we're doing one anyway. There's a very clear process on what we have to do. What's not so clear is how long these processes can take. And so the best way to facilitate this is to do your homework up front. So make sure that your studies are incredibly thorough. Make sure that your engagement with the community is sufficient enough so that when regulators want to understand if there's community acceptance, that folks are really familiar with that. And we really think about co-creating together, really understanding what the community's concerns are and looking at how we can modify plans based on that. But it is somewhat of a black box. As far as I know, there are new permitting regs, right? They're being talked about. So they probably won't be in place for our efforts. So we're working with what's in place today.
I've been given the please stop sign, but we'll get one more question and one short answer, and then we'll call it a day.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the community compliance, specifically from the policymaking point of view, though. So an article from MSCI states that 79% of lithium reserves are located within 35 miles of a Native American reservation in the U.S. There's, as we saw in the Thacker Pass mine, there's significant tension between those two interests, conflict and litigation, similar situation in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. So I wanted to understand from a government perspective, how can you streamline and reward those projects which are practicing best practice for community consultation and environmental compliance in order to negotiate that trade-off better? Thank you.
We spent a lot of time thinking about this. So from the loan programs office standpoint, we require every one of our projects to go through a community benefits planning process. So that, and the standpoint that we take is that it's good risk management. And that if you want to build a project that's going to have, if you're building an asset that has a 20 to 40 year lifespan, you're going to be in that community a long time. Maybe, just maybe, you want to employ some of the people in that community. And being a good neighbor goes a very long way. And I think for tribes in particular, and for our office, which has specifically a tribal loan program, we do our best to appreciate the history of historical injustice that has happened in the course of extraction of all kinds of things in the country. And to that end, the focus on social license to operate and the appreciation of tribal rights, land rights, and tribal ownership is something that I think we view as sort of a gating factor for any project going forward. Litigation is a business risk. And if you're not actually planning effective community engagement from start to finish, you're going to pay for it down the road in a different way. And so we want to make sure that at least our applicants are being thoughtful about this, because we expect to get paid back.
I also wanted to add from a private perspective, we do produce in Chile, and our predecessor company founded the lithium industry in Chile. And we have been employing the indigenous community since the start of our operation in 1980, and also providing funding for them. In 2016, we signed a voluntary agreement with them that runs through the life of our contract through 2043. 3/4 of it is focused on how we work together to ensure the sustainability of the salar. And then the other piece of that is benefits sharing. We're sharing 3.5% of our sales every single year with the community. They determine what they do with the projects, and it's just really inspiring to see what they've done with the money. So it's been a real success, and we're proud of that.
Thank you very much for great questions. Very nice final question as well. And of course, to the panel. We'll open the bar again. So have fun, and thank you again.
I'm in Philly this weekend.
Oh, yeah.
You got there? I went to university there, both my kids are university now.
I think I
I go for Saturday night when I'm in the States.
Where are they?